Hi and welcome to Midnight Cry. I'm your host, Roman Gussain, and today we have with us Jay Smith, who will be discussing with us some important findings on the history or the rise of Islam. First of all, welcome to the show, Jay.
Hey, it's good to be here, Roman.
Now, on the very last segment, we were talking about some recent findings which some European scholars have unearthed or uncovered for us. Perhaps if we can jump straight into that and we can compare that to what and mainstream Muslims have been saying for many centuries.
Exactly. Rommel, as we said in the last episode, the problem historically for Muslims and also for Islam in general concerns the sources. Where do we get this material on Muhammad? Where do we get the material on Mecca or the Quran or the emergence of Islam? Where does all this material come from? And as we said in the last episode, for Christianity, we don't have this problem. Christians can go back to their own sources. This is the question that Europeans have been bringing up. In his book, Dr. Tom Holland asked this very question, and also on the documentary called Islam, the Untold Story, he says, well, listen, we can go back to Christian sources. We know where the person of Jesus Christ, where he lived, we know what he said, we know basically most of his stories come from within Christian sources from the first century, from the same time period that Jesus lived, or directly after, and by people that knew Jesus. They were eyewitnesses to this material, but we cannot do this with Islam. Dr. Tom Holland is a historian. In fact, he has written The Rubicon, which is the story about the fall of the Roman Empire. He wrote Millennium, which is the fall of the Byzantine Empire. And he wrote Persian Fire, which is the fall of the Persian Empire. All of them are bestsellers. He's considered to be possibly one of the top historians in Britain today. Now, these empires, the Byzantine and the Sassanid Empire, they fell in around the 7th century. What came next? Islam came next.
Yes.
So he's the perfect person to then go and ask this question because he's done all the previous work concerning the other empires. And so his next question is, well, then what came out of that? Islam came out of that. Therefore, let's see how Islam began. And the first thing he was faced with was that there's no sources. Nothing from within Islamic sources to help him, to give him a handle. He had no problem finding out the Byzantines because there's lots of Byzantines wrote about what happened. He had no problem finding out about the Persians because the Persians all wrote about what was happening to them. But the Muslims wrote nothing, not a thing. And he said, this is unprecedented. There's no reference from within Islamic sources until the 9th century for that which happened in the beginning of Islam. Therefore, he had to go to other sources. He had to go back to extra-Quranic, extra-Islamic sources, including the Byzantine sources. He had to go back to the Persians themselves, the people that were being conquered by these not Muslims. This is what's interesting. These people that were conquering them never referred to themselves as Muslims. They never referred to themselves or their religion as Islam.
What did they refer to themselves as?
And what he found out from these writings, from the sources, the Byzantine sources and also the Persian sources, were that they referred to themselves as Saracens. They referred to themselves as Maghrayites. They referred to themselves as Ishmaelites. They referred to themselves as Hagarenes. Now, what does that say to you?
So people from certain parts or take a particular lineage, but not by their faith.
That's it. These are people who are from Arabia, who come from the line of Ishmael through Hagar, so that's why they're Hagarenes. They live in the Maghreb, that's why they're called Maghrebs. They are Saracens, that's the name that was the common name that was given to them by the Europeans. So these are secular names of people that were well known in that time, but they should have been calling themselves Muslims. Why didn't they use the word Muslim? So as a historian, you can see Tom's difficulty. As a historian, he said, this is unprecedented. If they didn't write about what they were doing, then I need to go to those people who did write, the people that were being conquered. And so he started going to their material, and there's lots of material about the conquests of these Arabs, these Saracens, these Maghrayites, these Ishmaelites, these Hagarenes. And it's that material from the 7th century that completely disputes the material from the 9th century, the Islamic traditions. That's what we want to unpack now. So let's start unpacking that a bit.
Yes, that's right. So when was the word Muslim first used? You're saying that that word Muslim was not used in the first few hundred years after the death of Muhammad.
Well, actually, not first few hundred years. We know of references to the word Muslim by the end of the 7th century. Dr. Patricia Corona. Dr. Patricia Corona is considered to be one of the primary scholars in the world today concerning not only that period, but also the material from that period. Dr. Patricia Corona from Denmark studied at School of Oriental African Studies under John Wansborough, Dr. John Wansborough, in the last century, and she has done probably the most germinal work concerning how the Islam emerged. And this woman went to the original sources. This woman can read and write 15 languages. Can you do that?
No way.
Can you see?
Yes.
She is a prodigious mind. More than that, she's a linguist. And so she's gone back to the Hebrew text, gone back to the archaic Arabic text, to the Armenian material, Akkadian material, all the material that we need to go back and that Muslims should have gone back to. Because this is their own history. Why haven't they done this with their own history?
Yes.
Why is it the Europeans are having to do this for them? Now, these are not Christians. I don't think Patricia Corona would ever call herself a Christian. These people are not religious at all. They are historians. They are linguists. They are academics. So this is the academic critique concerning the emergence of Islam. Now, Patricia Corona asked this question: why is it we can't find the word Muslim? The first reference she could find for Muslim does not begin to appear until the late 7th century, about the time of Abd al-Malik. Abd al-Malik is the caliph that ruled from 685 to 705. But let's back up. Let's back up and let's ask some earlier questions concerning what we do know. What we do know is that certainly these Arabs were nomadic. That's not in doubt. They were nomadic. They lived in the central part of Arabia called the Hijaz. That's not in dispute at all. They were kept in the desert by buffer states. Now, if you look on the map, we're going to show you the map of these buffer states, and you will see that over here in the east is the Persian Empire, and then up in the north is the Byzantine Empire. And the Persians and Byzantines were confronting each other for about 200 years, from the 5th, 6th up to the 7th century. These two great empires were confronting at war
yes.
over and over again. Sometimes the Byzantines were in ascendancy, sometimes the Persians were in ascendancy. Now, to keep the Arabs in the desert and to keep them from causing any problem, they would give money to these other smaller tribes. For the Byzantines, they were called the Ghassanids, and for the Persians, they were known as the Lakhmids. The Ghassanids kept the Arabs in the deserts and did not let them come in to bother the Byzantines. The Lakhmids did the same thing for the Persians and kept them in the desert from bothering the Persians or the Sassanids over here. And they were paid by both the Byzantines and the Sassanids. They were paid to do that. And as long as they got their money, they maintained that border, that protection.
So everything was fine. They didn't go anywhere.
That's
and
right.
So who were these Arabs?
Well, these Arabs, as we know, were Saracens. They were Maghrebs. They were just nomadic. They lived in the desert, and they would go from oasis to oasis. We know where those oases are. They have oasis down in the very south, that starting from the southern part of what is today Aden. I'm sorry, not Aden, but Aden is the city. Going up through Najran, Sana, going up to Taif, going up to Yathrib, Tabuk, Khaybar, and then all up to Gaza in the north.
So I just want to be really clear on this point. They didn't identify themselves as being Muslim.
Nope.
And neither did they follow some particular faith that was called Islam.
No.
That's certain.
They did have a faith in Allah. That is certain. Allah is pre-Islamic. Allah means the God. And they had a pagan view of God. They had a very pagan, pre-Islamic view of God. Now that's a whole other subject we're not going to get into in this episode. What we're interested in is these nomads who did believe in Allah. They had a Bismillah, but it's not the same Bismillah that we have today. And there was no reference to any Shahada. There is no reference to there's only one God, but God, and Muhammad is a prophet. That doesn't exist in any of their writings, in any of their references. There's no reference to that at all in any of the earliest material that we have from the 7th century. What is interesting, Dr. Yehuda Nevel is another name that you need to bring in. Dr. Yehuda Nevel probably has done the best work on looking at the inscriptions. And he's gone to hundreds of inscriptions from that part of the world known as Arabia. Today it's Saudi Arabia. Back then it was just known as the Arab Desert. And he has found inscriptions in Taif, inscriptions on a bridge in Taif, which is just southeast of Mecca. And he noticed that there's a Bismillah there, but it's not any reference to Muhammad is on it. There's no reference to the Shahada that God is one in Muhammad. Muhammad's name doesn't appear on any of those inscriptions.
Wow.
He looked at all the earliest caliphal protocols. These are the official writings of the caliphs from the Sufyani period of the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, the Umayyad Caliphate came into existence in 661, and the Umayyad Caliphate retained that power over that part of Arabia from 661 up until 749, just a little less than 100 years. And they had two large families within the Umayyad Caliph. You have the Sufyanis and you have the Marwanids. And the Sufyanis, starting with a man named Muawiyah, would write down these protocols, these official documents. Now, they should have been the first Muslims, shouldn't they?
Yes, yes.
Because they are the ones that take over from the first what we call the first rightly guided caliphs. After Muhammad came Abu Bakr, and he ruled from 632 to 634, according to Islamic tradition. After Abu Bakr came Umar, and he ruled from 644 to 654, according to Islamic tradition. Then comes Uthman. He takes over from 644 up until 656, about 12 years. And then he is killed, and Ali, the adopted son of Muhammad, then takes over from 656 to 661. And then at the Battle of Siffin, which he was defeated by the the Sufyanis, they then take over, and they then take over what Muslims tell us Islam. Problem is, we have material from the Umayyad Caliphate. We have material from the Sufyani family. No reference to Muhammad. No reference to themselves being called Muslims. The caliphal protocols that Dr. Yehuda Neville has looked at, there is nothing there about people called Muslims. Nothing there about them following a religion called Islam.
So you're simply saying that these people that were mentioned were simply accepted as leaders, people that had received some type of power or ownership, but they never made a reference to Muhammad as following him or him being the first prophet and they being Muslims.
That's it. And that's absolutely essential for Islam to be known, because that's what we have been told they did. Yet we can't find that from the sources. What's more interesting is, let's back up a little bit and we ask, what do we know and why is it that this is important? Well, if you look on the map again, let's take a look and see what happened within 10 years of Muhammad's death. Muhammad died in 632. Within 10 years, those that followed him, Abu Bakr and especially Umar, who is the next caliph, they then take over the 5 great cities of the Levant: Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. Those are the 5 great cities that were then conquered between 638, 639, 640. So within 8 to 10 years, these 5 great cities were conquered by these Arabs. Why? Because both the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire ran out of money.
Okay.
They could not maintain those buffer states. Those buffer states were not getting any money from the Sassanids or from the Byzantines. Therefore, they just let the Arabs come through. And the Arabs, as nomads, came right through, and there was a vacuum that existed in both those great empires. They were able to take over those major cities. So within 10 years of Muhammad's death, those 5 great cities were then conquered by these Arabs.
So then surely these 5 great cities would then have written or documented about them now becoming servants or becoming overthrown by some greater power.
Oh, they did. But they don't refer to them as Muslims.
Wow.
They don't refer to them as Islam at all. There is no reference to any revelation called the Quran. Isn't that curious?
Yes.
So what do they talk about? Well, let's back up again and let's ask, first of all, these are nomads, right? And this is the question that Muslims should have been asking, and this is what the Orientalists are asking. These are nomads. Nomads don't live in cities, do they?
No.
No, they move around in desert. They live on camels. They're moving all the time. They don't understand economic structures of cities. They don't understand sewage systems. They don't understand how cities are run.
And neither do they have an interest in it.
Well, they do have an interest because they're interested in the wealth of the cities.
Yes.
Because they want the wealth.
Yes, but
they
not
want
that
booty.
lifestyle, yes.
So what do? If they conquer the cities, what do? Well, they don't live in the cities because they're not urban to begin with. They live outside of the cities in what we call garrison towns. Now, see, this is well known. This is all documented. These garrison towns, there was a garrison town for Basra, one for Baghdad, another for Damascus, another for Jerusalem, another for Cairo. We know the names of the garrison towns. The garrison town for Cairo is called Fustat, outside of it. And that's where the Arabs lived. And they maintained control over the cities, but they couldn't run those cities, so what did they do? They retained the people that were already there. They kept the people that were already there to run the cities for them, because they knew the commerce, they had the relationships, they were the ones that also understood how to keep the sewer systems going, how to keep the roads going. All this that was happening that took to run an urban environment was run by these indentured servants called Maula or Mawali is the name that was given to them. They were kind of servants of the masters. And as servants to the masters, they took on Arab names, many of them. Most of them, however, tended to be Jews and Christians.
So they weren't Muslims either?
No, they were Jews and Christians. And it's these Jews and Christians that are the ones that give us most of the material to know what was happening at that time. Now, what's interesting is that these Arabs looked to the Jews and Christians as brothers from Abraham, because they both traced the lineage back to Abraham. The Jews and Christians through Isaac, these Arabs through Ishmael to Hagar to Abraham. So they both came from Abraham, so they had an affinity with them, and that's why they trusted them. And that's why there was an awful lot of alliance between them. What's interesting is that in not only trusting them, they also then realized that the Jews and Christians had a much greater identity, a much stronger identity, because they had a whole line of prophets that they could follow. They had a whole line of revelations that they could look at, called the Old and the New Testament, with all the prophetic lines in the Old Testament going up to the person of Jesus Christ. They themselves saw that they were part of that lineage, but there was one missing thing. What was missing? There was no Arab prophet.
Yes.
There was no Arab revelation. There was no Arab identity in that. So you can see what was happening as they conquered these cities and as they conquered these peoples. They not only were able to then take on their histories and their traditions, they realized that sooner or later they needed to create an Arab identity that they could look at, that would equal the identity of the Jews and Christians that they had conquered. So what are you going to do to do that? How are you going to create your own identity?
First of all, you have to choose someone. You have to nominate someone.
You have to find a prophet.
Yeah, that's
You have
right.
to nominate a prophet.
Yes.
And who are you going to use as your prophet? Well, you're going to use someone that's already well known. And of course, every Arab knew about Muhammad. Muhammad is historical. There is documentation to support him. The Doctrine of Iacobi, which is in the British Museum. The dates, some dispute the dates. Some say it's 643, others say it's 634. Nonetheless, the date of it is close enough to the Prophet's, Muhammad's life. Roughly about 10 years after his life. It refers to him by name. The Chronicles of Sabaeus also refer to this prophet, because Muhammad would have called himself a prophet. Any leader of men called themselves prophets. What was interesting is the earliest material we have on this man, Muhammad, comes actually from outside sources, not from Islamic sources, or sorry to say, not from Arab sources. And what they show us is a man who was a raider, who did raids. And he was the one that created a hegemony, a control of the central part of Arabia. But then he died before they could move out. And so it was those who came after him, like Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali, who then moved out, and particularly Umar, who then moved out and took over these great cities. Now, as they took over these great cities, they realized that sooner or later they're going to have to create that identity. And that identity was begun, according to what the historians are telling us, with a man named Abd al-Malik.
Wow.
Started with Abd al-Malik.
Wow.
Now, Abd al-Malik is going to come into this an awful lot, and you'll see why. Let's now back up and let's try to put it together. If you're going to have a prophet, he's going to have a book. So you're going to have to create a revelation that comes from him. So how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to have to start having it written down. Where are you going to get this material from? Well, you're going to start borrowing it from other sources. And when you look at the Quran, you will see that an awful lot of this book, an awful lot of the Quran, comes from other sources. And you will see a good bit of it comes from certainly the characters in the Quran, such as Abraham, or Abraham as we know him, or Moses, Dawud, David, Yahya, John the Baptist, Isa, Jesus. All these characters are part
the
of
Bible.
our tradition.
Yes.
There's a good 19 prophets in the Quran that come from the same prophets that we have in the Bible. But the problem is, when you look at these two books, and when you look at the Bible and the Quran, and you look at the prophets, you'll see the stories are quite different.
Very different.
These
Yes.
the stories in this do not parallel the stories in here. And that's why we know that they have been borrowed. But they haven't been borrowed from the Bible. So where were they borrowed from? That's $1 million question.
Yes.
We're going to be getting into that. We're not going to answer that one right now. Let's hold on to that when we come back to that later on. But if you're going to create a book, you've got to borrow from somewhere. And what they did is they used the Jews and the Christians that were there. They used the Jews and Christians, but the Jews and Christians were not giving them the stories from this book. And one of the reasons could be is that the Bible had not yet been translated into Arabic. It was not translated into Arabic until the late 8th century. So therefore, they didn't have the Bible in Arabic, for which those who put the Quran together needed. Now, you notice I say those, plural.
Yes.
It's obvious, therefore, that I'm assuming that Muhammad had nothing to do with the Quran. I'm biting off an awful lot in just saying that. We're going to get to that. We're going to come to that. Nonetheless, let's go back and let's say, if you're going to create an identity, you need to have an Arab as your prophet. Muhammad was then chosen. But he's going to have a book. So therefore, books are going to have to be put together. They're going to have to be revelations that are put together to create a revelation that comes from him. Difficulty is, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to be able to place it in a place. So you're going to have to put Muhammad in a place. Now, if you put Muhammad in a place, you're going to have to put him in Arabia.
Of course, in Mecca or Medina.
Aha. You would think Mecca.
Yes.
Because that's what the Muslims tell us. That's
Yes.
what all the Islamic traditions tell us. The historians are starting to question that. Dr. Patricia Corona especially is starting to question that, for one very good reason. She has asked this question, and she wrote a book back in 1987 called Meccan Trade in the Rise of Islam. And she just wanted to go into this and unpack that. Now, that's going to take quite a bit of time to unpack. So we're going to wait to the next episode to actually unpack Mecca for you. We're going to show you the problems with Mecca. We're going to show you the problems with placing Muhammad in Mecca. That's going to have to wait to the next episode. What we do want to say before we end this episode is, in order to really understand what was happening in the 7th century, we need to go back to the 7th century. We need to go back to that material. And what we're going to find is that there are things in the Quran that just don't make sense for a place called Arabia. For instance, in the Quran, it mentions about olives. And it talks about the olives that Muhammad must be eating. But ask yourself, are there any olive trees in Arabia?
It's a desert.
You've never had olive trees. Olive trees don't exist in Arabia. So how could Muhammad be eating olives? The only olive trees are about 1,000 miles north. In the Quran, it mentions also that Muhammad goes past the pillar of salt from which the wife of Lot was made into, which means it has to be Sodom. But is Sodom in Arabia?
No.
Did Lot ever live in Arabia? Did his wife become a pillar of salt there in Arabia? No, that's about 1,000 miles north as well. In the Quran, it also refers to an awful lot of vegetation that existed there around Mecca and Medina. Is there any vegetation there?
No.
Take a look at it. Even today, it's still a desert. It was a desert 1,400 years ago, which suggests that even where this book was written, the people that were writing it did not live in Arabia, and certainly not in the central part of Arabia, and not in the Hijaz, and certainly not in Mecca. There's a real problem here. And that's why the historians are saying we need to rethink this whole thing again. What we're going to do is we're going to start looking and unpacking this a bit. We're going to ask, is there any place called Mecca prior to the time of Muhammad? We're going to ask, is there any documents that can help us to unpack, to see where Muhammad lived, and whether or not even the Quran that we see described here, whether or not that could be in Arabia, or is this book been put together at a much later date?
Wow.
Dr. John Wansborough, who is head of department at School of Oriental and African Study, blew this whole thing open with 2 books called Sectarian Milieu and Quranic Studies. And he looked at the Quran. He says a lot of the stories in here could not have existed in Arabia in the 7th centuries. This could have only existed in the 8th century. We're going to leave it there and go to the next episode, and then we're going to start showing you just how much of the Quran is not only fraudulent, but historically unacceptable.
Wow. Jay, thank you for that.
Oh, well, good. This is good stuff, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. I mean, what we've been able to do on this segment is really go back to the basics, look at history, look at the foundation of Islam. And I really want to ask our Muslim brothers and sisters a really hard question. What is it that you believe? What is it that you're basing it on? Are you simply basing it on what someone has told you, or is there historical evidence to support that? That's all we're asking. Please stay in tune for the very next episode of Midnight Cry, and may God bless you.